So today's session, Ecology of Dakota Landscapes, with W. Carter Johnson and Dennis Knight. Dr. Johnson is a distinguished professor emeritus in the Department of Natural Resource Management at South Dakota State University. His research is focused on the Missouri River prairie restoration, landscape ecology, and the effects of climate change on wetlands in the prairie pothole region. Johnson has taught courses in ecology and land management, served on 4 National Research Council panels, and earned national awards from the Ecological Society of America and the Environmental Law Institute. Dennis Knight grew up in Clear Lake and is professor emeritus in the botany department at the University of Wyoming, where he taught ecology and forest management from 1966 until 2000. His research focuses on the effects of natural and human-caused disturbances on forest and grassland ecosystems in the Rocky Mountains and Great Plains. A former president of the Ecological Society of America, Knight is the author of Mountains and Plains and the co-author of Ecology of Dakota Landscapes, which they're going to talk about today. So please welcome them.
Well, hello, and thank you for coming. Looks like an attentive audience, and I think we're going to have a good time. Dennis Knight and I, of course, will be talking about the ecology of Dakota ecosystems. That's our subject for the next 40 minutes or so. I guess we'll try to finish a little before 12:15, so if there are questions, we'll try to answer them for you. So I'll probably take about 10 minutes, give you an overview of the book, and then Dennis will come in and focus more on a specific ecosystem, and you might guess what that might be, where we are located. Yeah, that's it. So Dennis, who is the expert in that area, and it's not me, will certainly tell us about what the book is telling us and some interesting facts about the Black Hills. So Dennis and I have been talking about this project for some time. We finally got around to putting pencil to paper some years ago.
Like 20 years ago.
Oh my goodness. We're not that old, are we, Dennis? But we did have some principles of our own that we wanted to adopt in writing the book, and which separated it from some other books, maybe made some improvements in what other books are available, or maybe improvements in our own books in this writing of the Dakota landscape book. So what were those principles? I wrote them down because it was a few years ago when we did this, when we were thinking at this point. Certainly, we wanted to have a comprehensive book. There is no book that includes all of the Dakota's ecosystems. You can get things on the Black Hills, you can find books on the Badlands, Missouri River, and so on, but there's nothing that really puts them all together again. And we have about a dozen. So there's about a dozen fairly significant ecosystems that occur here, and we've put them together and tried to tie them together as much as we can. Also, there are a lot of sources of information that don't always get bubbled up into the public. And a lot of information sits in academic journals and in government reports and so on. And we've done our best to increase that amount of information that's going to come into this book that's really not been brought out before. So that was another goal of ours. We wrote for a general audience. We're trying to not use jargon and write things simply, but still in an accurate way. And so the book is more readable, but yet it's still giving you good, solid, fact-based information. We wanted a well-illustrated book. So there are, in this book, 200 and some odd photographs, color photographs. And there's one or two that have a whole page. So the book is well sprinkled with photographs and with captions. And then this might be the most important thing, and that's that we're doing a past, present, and future. So we're not just talking about what the Black Hills are like today, which is significant enough. and certainly hard enough to do. But we're going back. We went back to about 60 million years here in South Dakota, and took a look and see, well, what was living here, what was growing here, what was running around here, and what was the landscape like, what was the land cover like, and then how has it changed from then through a whole series of evolutionary episodes all the way up to what we have now. But we didn't stop with now. We said, well, what about the rest of this century? There's a lot of talk about what's going to happen in the next part of this century, especially with climate change, and it's not just that. So we have added that element. At each of our chapters, there's a section that talks about using peer-reviewed literature from the best folks we've got that study this, with what's likely to happen to these various ecosystems in the next 50 to 75 years. And some of it's, of course, already started. So those are the main components we felt we had to have in this book, and I think we reached it, at least to our satisfaction. We'll see if it is to yours. But there should be look a little different to this book than most other ones. We've also arranged the chapters to be, each chapter is a different ecosystem. So if you look at the table of contents, you'll see there's a chapter named Badlands, there's a chapter named Rivers, there's a chapter named Wetlands, and there's one named Agriculture, and so on. And so you can find things easily, and they're arranged in that kind of order as well. The book's been out for about a year, and so you might wonder, well, how well is it selling? Are people interested in this book? Are they picking up on these ideas? And we don't have a lot of information on that, but we did find out that in the first 5 months, which was about 5 months ago or so, there were about 1,000 books sold. And so I'm thinking, well, I don't know much about book sales, but it sounds pretty good to me. So there seems to be some interest out there in what we're doing, and now we won't find out until we get to the end of this year before we find out what the sale is. But it was heartening to realize that people are getting into it, and maybe all that work, those long nights, Dennis, and arguments back and forth about which way should we go here, this way or that way, might pay off. That would be great. There are 2 classes at SDSU that are using the book, so that's another high point, I think, in the book getting picked up. And
who's the teacher?
I'm the teacher to one of them. Yes, yeah. And then there's another teacher. One is landscape architecture, and then one is on the book, and it's an honors class. So kids coming from all different programs, and it's been really interesting to teach that class. We're about a month and a half into school, so it's been they're doing very well, and they seem to really like the book. So that's good as well. And I did use the book as some indication of, I asked them, well, we wrote this for a general audience, and that would include you, of course. What do you think? Do you have a lot of questions? Are you reading it easily, or do you have to go to the dictionary or anything? No, they didn't. They felt it was flowing pretty well. So that's good as well. Then there's a Native American class that's a composite of Native American students from different states that come here every year to take a class, and they can get college credit for that, and they're using the book. So I was very heartened to see the Native Americans interested in the book. And so we had a little session a couple days ago, a Zoom session, and got started. I'm not going to be involved very much, but they did ask me to give some introductory comments. So that's going on. There are a lot of people that are engaged in outdoor sports that have bought the book. Could be hunters, fishermen, hikers, bird watchers, and so on, people that spend a lot of time outdoors. But there's also a lot of people who like to know what's going on in the conservation world, in the natural world. They don't get out much, but they read a lot, and they find the book very, very interesting and useful for them at all as well. And Dennis made the point when we were writing the book that he wanted to make the captions longer for each of the pictures, and I wasn't so sure why he wanted to do that, because the printers are going to say, well, it's more space, it's more space. But he found out from his book that there are a lot of people that maybe even the first time they go through the book, they look at the pictures and they want to sort of get an idea of what's in there, what's the subject, and if the captions are too skimpy, it's not telling you much. So fill them out a little bit, and then by the time you get through, you can say, yeah, I think this Missouri River chapter it's the one for me. I can tell from the captions and from the pictures, and so we think that's another helpful sign is to have done that. So that's my introduction to the book, and hopefully you get an idea of what we've been up to and what the condition of the book is and what how we're moving forth and so on. But I'm going to turn it over to Dennis, and I think we're going to hear about the Black Hills, Dennis, aren't we?
A little bit.
A little bit, okay.
I thought of a few other things last night that I wanted to say as well. So.
He's always doing that on me. No. Well, good. That's good.
Okay, well, this is a wonderful opportunity that we have here to visit with people who are writing about nature from various perspectives, helping people understand the world around us, and that involves people from all walks of life, fiction writers, nonfiction writers. In our case, we've written a science book, what some people might think of as a textbook, some people might think of as a reference book. I don't like to think of it as a reference book. Carter suggested if you want to read about Missouri River, well, you might want to go to that particular chapter. People ask me, is this a reference book? And I said, well, yes, it could be used as a reference book. Maybe if it's in a library and somebody comes in and they want to read something about the Black Hills that's been written recently, an update from mid-level synthesis of the ecological scientific literature on the Black Hills, our book is a good reference book for that. There are lots of entries for the Black Hills in the table of content, in the index. But the implication sometimes is that it's not a book to be read from cover to cover. And that rubs me wrong. Is it just because I'm an author that I want to think that it's meaningful from the cover to cover? Well, I think that is definitely the case. Now, we've picked a big topic, and yet our ecology of Dakota landscapes, and we write about North and South Dakota in here, a lot of similarities between the two states. But it's a big topic. Ecology of Dakota landscapes, past, present, and future. How can you possibly do that in a book that's less than 300 pages long in terms of text? That's a big topic to cover. Well, we didn't want to write about everything. It's not a long book. It's 275 pages long, and there are 200 photographs in here, more or less. It doesn't take long to read this book. Read it cover to cover, because I think you can come away thinking differently than if you just use it as a reference book. So we tried to do this in a way that is meaningful. Now, we've also done more than what we think is a typical natural history book that tells you how to identify the reptiles and amphibians, how to identify the birds, and so on. Those are wonderful books, and they serve an important niche. But this is more of a science book. And it's a mid-level synthesis, though, that we'd like to think is accessible to a broad range of people. People who are working for the National Forest Service, people working for the National Park Service, ranchers, farmers. And it's also a book about conservation. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard about people talking about science-driven conservation. I don't think that's a good way of thinking about conservation. Conservation is not science-driven, it's science-based. As scientists, we're not trying to convince you to do something. As scientists, we're trying to describe what happens if something happens. How the environment changes, how management practices change, what other things change. It's for society as a whole to decide whether what direction to go. So this is a book about science-based conservation. Conservation, however, is a very humanitarian subject. I mean, the humanities involve conservation. It's more of a humanities topic than it is a science topic. What we have written about is the science that underlies various decisions that have to be made these days pertaining to conservation. Now, one of the big issues these days is climate change. And here's where I am going to talk for just a few minutes about the Black Hills, because what we have here in the Black Hills is something that is rather frightening to think about. For many people who think about the wonderful forests we have that are common throughout the Black Hills region, the ponderosa pine forest, spectacular forests. But you look at the climate change models and you think in terms of the ecology of ponderosa pine, and it becomes apparent that ponderosa pine is on the edge of its main distribution range. It's already in somewhat of a marginal environment. And for those of us who grew up in eastern South Dakota, we think that coming to the Black Hills is going to where the environment is very good for ponderosa pine. And it certainly is, and it still is probably. But if you look at the distribution of ponderosa pine and the continent, we are on the far northeastern edge of its distribution. This means, and this knowledge and efforts have made to model or to project the climate into the future suggest that the climate is likely to become this century much less favorable for ponderosa pine than it has been in the past. Now, there are a couple of things that are pertinent to this concern. One is that the environment required for the establishment of new ponderosa pine seedlings is very much dependent on climate. As the climate changes in the future, is going to become drier, and is projected by people who have studied this issue in more than one study that the environment is likely to become less favorable for the reproduction of young seedlings as these forests are affected by fires. Fires are likely to become more common in the future. We already have seen that the size of the fires in the Black Hills have increased by about 10 times, and they're becoming more frequent. And once those fires occur, the new forests develop largely from pine seedling establishment. Now, tree establishment in the Black Hills seems very good. But keep in mind that there are places where there are no trees. Some of you are familiar with this area, know about Reynolds Prairie, Gillette Prairie, and those are interesting to think about. Why are there no trees in these areas that are a square mile in size or more, where there are no trees? They become converted to prairies. Well, that's an interesting puzzle, and we're still working out on what exactly might be the causes of that. But it seems as though seedling establishment, for some reason or the other, has not been very good in those treeless areas within the Black Hills. There apparently are no obvious soil differences that anybody has identified thus far. Well, in year 2000, any of those of you who lived around here remember the Jasper Fire. Very extensive fires in southern Black Hills. Covered thousands of acres. I've forgotten exactly now just how large it was. But the fires we covered have created such a large area that now and it was very intense. So intense that apparently a lot of the seed was burned during that time, and now so far, seed regeneration in those areas has become very minimal. So what we have is a situation where very likely the Jasper burn is not going to come back to forest, at least for a long time. Once the prairie plants become established in that area, then they provide tremendous competition for the young tree seedlings, and they don't invade very rapidly. Also, that prairie tends to burn more frequently, which kills young seedlings that are likely to become involved, which favors become established, which favors the grasses and the forbs. So what we have here is a situation where it's very difficult for the forest to regenerate, and it's likely that we're going to have more big fires in the Black Hills in the future, and also seedling reestablishment is going to be minimal in many areas. So this is a topic that is of considerable interest to people these days because it makes the Black Hills unique. Of course, the Black Hills will always be unique because they have unique environments. What we have here is a situation that's very interesting ecologically. Now, there are other iconic landscapes. I'd just like to mention a few. And I think by reading the book from cover to cover, it's possible to gain a better perspective of this place where we live, called South Dakota, or North Dakota if you live further to the north. We've got the prairie pothole region, for example, which is so important to people who live in that area. An area that is extremely enables the survival of and the migration and production of large numbers of waterfowl of various kinds. It'd be hard to imagine living in eastern South Dakota without the waterfowl migration and all of the birds that are produced in that area. It's a characteristic of that particular area. The prairie pothole region is, of course, the glaciated part of the Dakotas, which, however, coincides with the best agricultural land. As it turns out, the glaciers east of the Missouri and the Dakotas are the best agricultural land. Glaciated soils, relatively young, are more fertile and have been, in many places, are the best agricultural land that we have in the state. Those grasslands out there in the prairie pothole region have been converted to farmland over large areas. Well, that of course is a major conflict, and what we can do is we can look at the effects of agriculture, we can look at the effects of climate change on those areas, and we can have something to add to the discussion about how these lands should and can be managed. Other iconic landscapes like the Missouri River. Carter has written a lot about that over the years during his career, and he's written a chapter that is very up to date and informative about the issues associated with managing stream flow and the rivers in the state. I want to just say a little bit in concluding about what it means to convert grasslands to farmland. This is a topic that we've discussed at length in our book, an overview, and obviously our farmlands are different kinds of ecosystems than what existed here previously. We discussed the history of agriculture because you cannot ignore agriculture in the state, and this is a significant part of this kind of ecology book. Ecology is not just about what existed here originally, but ecology is about agro-ecosystems as well as native ecosystems. It's hard to imagine that what can be done to curb some of the adverse effects that have occurred as a result of the agriculture that has occurred throughout our state over such large areas. But we were destined to use these fertile soils for agriculture. It was just part of our makeup to when Europeans arrived, when we had the horse-drawn plow. It was just natural for us to think in terms of producing food from these lands, and we have in fact become a breadbasket for the world in many ways throughout the northern Great Plains on these glaciated soils in particular. So what we have now is a situation where what can we do to make those agricultural lands sustainable? Well, there's a whole subject of agroecology that has developed to think these kinds of problems through. And one of the promising aspects of this work has led to the concept of regenerative agriculture, where the focus is on thinking in terms of what is it that has enabled the production of large amounts of food that we produce on these lands, and how can that be maintained? And a lot of that is discussed in our book, and it's something that we are hopeful that people will find interesting, because in the end we've got to think in terms of drawing farmers and ranchers into working on making these lands sustainable as well as town people. I think I've talked enough here probably, but I'd just like to point out that there are options now available for the management of these lands, for helping farmers do the right thing. Conservation finance is becoming available. People are recognizing that there are ecosystem services that can be provided by farmlands. In some cases, that carbon sequestration is a potential use of these farmlands in some cases while still producing cropland. There are examples of this that we have discussed in this book, and we'd like to think that as time goes on we'll understand these ecosystems better, so that there will be policies made that will enable them to be managed in a more sustainable way. I would just like to end by reading a sentence that we conclude one chapter with. Life on the northern Great Plains has changed dramatically since the advent of horse-powered machinery. A mere 5 generations ago. Changes will continue. There are reasons and viable options for doing better. However, as the agrarian philosopher Wendell Berry asserts, it won't happen unless a lot of people, consumers and producers, townspeople and city people and country people, conservationists and land users get together deliberately to make it happen. So I'd like to conclude with that, and we'll see if there are any questions.
Any questions from either one of us? Mm-hmm.
You said that the book brings out into the open topics or updates that had previously just been in academic journals or government reports. What are some examples of some of those topics that might be the most important for us to learn about and for the public to know?
Should go ahead, Dennis.
Go ahead, I gotta take a drink of water.
Mm-hmm. Some more water here somewhere.
Would you repeat that question, please?
So when you were talking about how the book brings out into the open topics that have been previously just in academic journals or government reports,
Okay.
what are some examples of those topics?
Yeah. Well, how many references did we
Yeah.
cite?
There's about 800 references in the back of the book. These are the end notes, the little numbers, above the words, that hopefully are small enough that they don't get in your way for the reading. But there's about 800 that are listed there, but actually it's more from the standpoint of, I don't know how many we actually went through. Some of them we didn't find anything of particular use. Some was redundant, some maybe was questionable. So we settled on 800 or whatever that number is that we thought were relevant and gave us a little more factual, science-based bounce to the book. So And
Well-
by the way, you could follow, if you wanted to go deeper, those little numbers you can trace back to a reference, and you can talk to your librarian, and some of them you can get fairly easily, and some would not be easy to get. The ones that are cited as science journal articles are pretty easy to get, but some of the agency, federal or state agency reports might be a little bit harder to get. But if you want to dig in, you certainly could, and we're welcome to having you do that.
The entire book is based on scientific literature, peer-reviewed literature. We're not writing from, this is not anecdotal at what we're writing about. The research that I described on climate change in the Black Hills is in several journals now. And what we have here is summarize that in a way that we think is generally accessible to many readers. And for people who want more detail, we have numerous, we probably have several hundred endnotes in the book. And then those refer to the references in the journals that are peer-reviewed. Almost all of the literature that we use is peer-reviewed. There's been some papers, for example, published on the Jasper fire, and those are the ones that we cite. And the Missouri River, Carter, of course, has had a lot of experience keeping up on that literature since he was in graduate school. A lot of people, other people, some of his students have worked on the Missouri River, and we have relied on that to present what we think is an up-to-date discussion that we hope would be useful to people sitting around the table and trying to decide what next to do. Grassland ecology has been a very popular topic of research, and agroecosystem ecology, we got into that literature. So in all cases, what we've written is based on the literature. Specific examples, what comes to mind right at the moment is, for example, several studies now have shown how most of the biomass of the grassland ecosystem is below ground. So that is not surprising then that most of the herbivory is going to be below ground. In fact, while we always focus our attention on large mammals, cattle, sheep, bison, elk, as being the major herbivores in a grassland ecosystem, in fact, far more energy goes into nematodes and other kinds of invertebrates in the soil. That's significant when you think about the management of a grassland. Should we be, if we're going to manage herbivory in a grassland, we need to focus on the microorganisms as well. Of course, it's those microorganisms that have led to the production of those soils on which we now depend. Those kinds of ecological phenomena that we address in the book.
There's a related element to the peer review process that we also had peer review from experts, and some of those we chose because they were colleagues and they reviewed our individual chapters. They were changed if necessary and so on. Then that moves up the line, and our publisher, Yale, had several rounds of reviews going out not only for economic purposes, but if this book can make enough money to pay all the bills, or is it good enough quality to actually publish. And that decision didn't come till quite late. They keep it late to make sure this is ready to go. And so we really did spend, maybe it was the whole last year, it seemed like, going back and dealing with reviewers and modifying things as needed and so on. So it's that part of the writing and so on was a fair amount of work, but it made it better, no question about it. So there's a question back here.
Yeah, I'm curious how we both think about how our shared narratives about our surrounding landscapes affect our culture,
How we hope the book does what? Excuse me.
How you hope your book affects culture?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think that the more we learn about the landscapes, the ecosystems that exist in the Dakotas, on the Great Plains, something that Carter and I both grew up with, the more we learn about them, the more fascinated and complex we become by we are by those phenomena that we see. What goes on below the soil. A lot of times when we study ecosystems, we're studying things that you can't see, that have to be measured, and those are phenomena that are amazing. It's like what's going on in the ground below our feet. The microbial food webs that lead to soil fertility. It becomes more amazing, and as we come to appreciate them more. And I think we like talking about these kinds of things in our classes and when we're on field trips and so on. We've used a lot of the photographs to illustrate some of the amazing phenomena that occur in our landscapes, and it's been fun to write about that, and we hope it conveys that other people who read about that will gain some of the, will be, find that interesting as well. And with that understanding, maybe work more to protect those natural resources. The other thing is that a better understanding of what's limiting and what is rare, what is common, may help us set priorities in terms of our conservation. And that when it, like I said at the beginning of what with this science base, we may be able to make better decisions about what our focus should be when it comes to conserving the soil and the biological diversity. Planning ways of proceeding to manage the land in ways that we do not further degrade soil quality and availability and degrade the level of biodiversity is a goal that seems to be important to society. And we'd like to think that understanding the ecosystems and the landscapes enables us to do a better job of that.
Jerry?
Having read the book, I fully endorse the idea that this is a book of scientific depth and yet quite accessible. I'm not a scientist, I'm a sort of lifelong conservationist, but certainly don't qualify as a scientist, but I understand what I'm reading, and that's very important. In fact, the 200 and some photographs and illustrations alone, if as many casual readers might just leaf through and look at the pictures and read the captions, there's a depth of education just there.
Good.
So I'd really recommend people take a look.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry.
Question.
Yeah.
First of all, I work for Wyoming State Forestry. I'm a forester in District 1, so Newcastle to Sundance basically is our work area. And first of all, I appreciate your work. Most of the times, the Black Hills kind of gets lumped in with the Rocky Mountains, and our ecosystems aren't the same. Or,
Yeah.
Nothing like those higher elevations, lodgepole and stuff like that. With what you were saying, being on the edge of sort of Ponderosa's growing area, and the Black Hills, whether you think it's mismanaged or undermanaged, it's the most heavily managed, probably forest, maybe in the United States.
Yeah.
you can't convince me that there's not a square foot that hasn't been touched by a logger probably at some point in the Black Hills. With that, we rely on that economy. I mean, look at all this wood in this room. It's probably built on wood coming from the Black Hills. How do we protect the ecology, or the ecosystems, not so much the ecology? How do we protect those ecosystems? Meanwhile, keep the history of the Black Hills sort of prevalent the way it always has been, but also protect our forest. Because even we see a lot less indicator species like arrowleaf, balsam root, stuff like that. We're obviously seeing less, but we're starting to see more oak. Do we look at becoming an oak forest? I mean, who's to say ponderosa is the apex species? Why are we so, do we look at just having a different forest type? Do we fight it? Do we, how? What is I mean, I know it's a big, broad question, but.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And I think that we're probably going to have less ponderosa pine forest and more ponderosa pine savannas, which isn't a bad thing.
Yeah.
We're probably going to have more prairie. If those prairies can be dominated by native species, that's not such a bad thing.
Right.
The timber industry may not have as much wood in the future as it does now, because the trees may not grow as rapidly and they won't be growing as densely, which could be a good thing if we're concerned about fire suppression, fire management. Because fire suppression in the Black Hills has created severe problems in terms of, essentially in the process of wherever ponderosa pine grows throughout its range in the west, in the southwest, you suppress fires long enough, you create a condition that leads to fires that you cannot suppress or even put out very well, very easily. So there are significant problems associated with that, and we also now, as far as oak is concerned, oak requires fairly moist environment too.
Yeah.
And the droughts may lead to the death of the oaks. And possibly aspen will be less common over in some places. I don't think we're talking about the extinction of these species in the Black Hills. But they'll become less common. There'll be changes, and we'll have to adapt to these climatic changes which we cannot manage.
Right.
What else? The Black Hills will probably be more favorable for livestock grazing or bison grazing, grazing mammals. Some of the birds and other organisms that are common now may become a little less common, but other species will become more common. There'll be ways of, the Black Hills will still always be a unique environment. It's surrounded by the Great Plains, grasslands and shrublands in the lowlands that are much drier, but the mountains will always create a unique environment. It'll always be a different place to go. People will still be attracted to the area, but it'll look different.
Right. We just can't be afraid of it looking different, right?
Yeah.
It's just going to.
Yeah.
It's just, that's ecology.
Yeah.
Right?
And one of our major goals ought to be to minimize the problems associated with invasive weeds,
Right.
especially if they become invasive and serious problems. Some of our introduced species maybe are going to remain, and we'll be glad to have them in some situations, because to eliminate them at this point in a changing climate may be more disruptive than having the plants there at all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Pretty well.
We're out of time, so thank you
Okay.
guys.
Yep.
It's,
Thank you.